Welcome to the Synthesis of Yoga, the book that changed my life. We have reached the 7th chapter of part 1 of the Synthesis of Yoga. Link to this chapter is in the description. For those who are new, we are reading the Synthesis of Yoga of Sri Aurobindo line by line to take a deep inner imprint of his yogic consciousness. And reading is the best way to come in touch with his ways of seeing and internalize, absorb that consciousness and open to its light and force. In the last episode, which was 94, Sri Aurobindo gave us the picture of how the third level of social code of conduct come into picture. First two are the individualistic and collectivistic tendencies, largely driven by vital physical nature, the animal instincts, basic survival instincts, reproductive instincts, propagation instincts. And these two individualistic and communalistic tendencies, collectivistic tendencies, come in conflict. And in that context, above that emerges the third step where the mind begins to develop and we are able to override the impulses and bring mental principles and synthesize or attempt to synthesize these two conflicting forces. And that is where the beginning of ethical mental man with intellectual, aesthetic developments, intellectual, cultural development, all that begins to refine man's nature. So we move from vital physical man to mental man. Now we will be diving deeper further. We are on episode 95, paragraph 17. See the link below in the description. Follow the chapter. The natural law of conduct proceeds from a conflict to an equilibrium of forces. Conflict to an equilibrium of forces, impulsions, and desires. The natural law of conduct. That is the level 1 and level 2 of social codes of conduct. Level 1 is the natural law of the individual, which propels him to fulfill his personal needs, desires, and demands. And level 2, there is social law of conduct, natural law of society, which is again an extension of the same animal instinct, conservative instinct, that propels itself to fulfill its needs, desires, and demands. So these forces, propulsions and desires, they are pressing upon each other. And they find an equilibrium, a working equilibrium. That is what normally happens in a pre-mental stage society. And the natural law of conduct proceeds from a conflict to an equilibrium of forces. From conflict to equilibrium, they find the right balance between the individualistic tendency and the collective force and its enforcement. There is finding out the right balance between them, an equilibrium of forces, impulsions, and desires. It's not so much intelligence, it is not reason and light, but forces, impulsions, and desires. That governs the society, bringing together these two master instincts and finding its right balance. The higher ethical law proceeds by the development of the mental and moral nature towards a fixed internal standard, or else a self-formed ideal of absolute qualities: justice, righteousness, love, right reason, right power, beauty, light. These are all ethical ideals. Mind comes up with its ideals. It could be an internal standard of reference. An individual develops his own internal value system. We refer to a value-based life, principled life, where you follow certain policies, certain principles. Now, same thing gets extended into an ideal of absolute qualities like justice, righteousness. So I'm fighting for justice. I want to establish justice. People should get justice. There should be a place to get justice. Righteousness, love, right reason, right power, beauty, light. But things like beauty itself is a reference for an idealist. Beauty can be an expression of truth. Behind beauty, there is presence of truth. So all that emerges from the development of the mind and its intellectual growth. So it follows the development of mental and moral nature towards a fixed internal standard. Fixed internal standard. So the standard becomes the reference point, the North Star of your journey. This is what I will follow. For example, Gandhiji was following ahimsa as a reference, an internal reference. No matter what he did, he looked at that as a reference point. Most leaders do have clarity on what is their uncompromising value reference. That generally is some internal reference. Various philosophies follow certain principles like equality, justice, truth, goodness. All that come into picture. So the natural law of conduct proceeds from a conflict to an equilibrium of forces, impulsions, and desires. The higher ethical law proceeds by the development of the mental and moral nature towards a fixed internal standard, or else a self-formed ideal of absolute qualities: justice, rightness, love, right reason, right power, beauty, light. It is therefore essentially an individual standard. It is not a creation of the mass mind. So this ethical, moral ideals that forms first as an internal reference, internal standard, and then propagated into the society, it is essentially an individual standard. It is not creation of a mass mind. The collective mind doesn't form such ideals. It is the individual who discovers them, enforces it on oneself by the light of reason, and demand everyone else to follow that. It is therefore essentially an individual standard. It is not a creation of the mass mind. The thinker is the individual. The thinker is the individual. Mass doesn't think. Mass consciousness is group think. There is no originality in it. It's habit-driven, half-conscious, mechanical. The thinker is the individual. It is he who calls out and throws into forms that which would otherwise remain subconscious in the amorphous human whole. So in the collectivity, in the collective consciousness, it remains subconscious, amorphous. It is there. There are things going right or wrong in the society, and some of the individuals, while everyone feels it subconsciously, semi-consciously, amorphously, some individuals spot it very clearly, precisely, articulate it, gives it word, and brings it out to conscious mind. That is the role of a thinker. And that thinker is always an individual who looks at the collective life, understands, feels the underlying movements, and give it word, thinks through it, sees the cause and effect, connections between things, and gives it a verbal articulation, a vision to the group. So what was subconscious in the group become conscious through the individual for the collectivity. So the thinker is the individual. It is he who calls out and throws into forms, calls out and throws into form that which would otherwise remain subconscious in the amorphous human whole. So that's a unique function the individual serves in the collectivity. The very reason why when we read some books, we feel, wow, all that was happening inside me, you have given it word. Now it is much more clear, precise, because you have articulated it, given it word. We can experience that. So the one who gives form, articulates it, is serving a very crucial function in the society by making what was a collective experience but amorphous, subconscious. He takes it out, pulls it out, gives it form, and make it conscious, articulated, precise. The moral striver is also the individual. Self-discipline, not under the yoke of an outer law, but in obedience to the internal light, is essentially an individual effort. So when an individual, for example, is attempting to live a simple life, high ideal, high principles, speak only truth, be generous, helping people. So all those principles, it is not because someone else is imposing it on you. You are not stealing, not because there is a law enforcement agency, but because you have an internal reference that is telling you stealing is not the right thing to do. Telling lie is not the right thing to do. Helping others is a good thing to do. Loving and caring for those who are in need is a good thing to do. Justice has to be followed. Whether there is a law enforcement agency or not, whether there are courts or not, you follow justice. There is natural justice that you can feel, you can give it articulation, and you can give it form. So wherever there is exploitation, someone would come and articulate and expose it, clarify it. This is exploitation. It should not be happening. Therefore, there is here injustice. We need to correct that. These are all the functions the thinker does. And moralist also, the moral striver also is the individual who brings self-discipline, not under the yoke of an outer law, but in obedience to an internal light. And such a person is essentially an individual, and such an effort is essentially an individual effort. But by positing his personal standard as the translation of an absolute moral ideal, the thinker imposes it not on himself alone, but on all individuals whom his thought can reach and penetrate. So such a thinker doesn't exist in isolation. First, he is imposing on himself, but it doesn't end there. Wherever he can influence, wherever his thought and vision can reach out, it will influence, and he will be able to impose that inner laws on an outer society and larger group of people. And that is the function the thinker does in a society. But by positing his personal standard as the translation of an absolute moral ideal, so there is a personal standard set by individuals. When we say someone has the integrity, there we see the perfect alignment of what they are saying as my values, what I stand up for, and in their action. They set that as a standard of their own conduct. And through that, the thinker imposes it not on himself alone, but on all individuals whom his thought can reach and penetrate. Some people are impenetrable. You cannot get inside them. You cannot give the light that you have found. Some are penetrable. So wherever there is a possibility of shedding that light and understanding, wherever there is receptivity, a thinker is able to spread that code of conduct, that standard set by oneself, for oneself. Now you are able to extend it to others as well. As the mass of individuals come more and more to accept it in idea, if only in an imperfect practice or no practice, society also is compelled to obey the new orientation. So as it starts with one individual and it spreads into more people, and the more people begin to follow the same codes of conduct, eventually it forces that ideal get enforced into the society, not by any force but natural propagation into society. And society take on a new orientation. Slavery was justified in the past, it is no more. A new orientation has stepped in. Gender equality was again new orientation that is established. So abolition of all kinds of inequalities, where the transition were done, these transitions were done by individuals who took on this as this is not acceptable. And they establish it in their own code of conduct and then inspire others to do the same. And slowly the society changes. So as the mass of individuals come more and more to accept it in idea, if only in imperfect practice or no practice, society also is compelled to obey the new orientation. So even if individuals are not able to live it fully, very reception of the idea and accepting that this idea is good, even if I'm not able to live up to it, the idea is inserted, embedded in the collective consciousness. Slowly the society changes, creates a new orientation. It absorbs the ideative influence and tries, not with any striking success, to mold its institutions into new forms touched by these higher ideals. So, as the idea spreads into the collectivity, eventually the society begins to remold its institutions, remold the way various institutions function, whether it is marriage, legalities, finances, who can do what. All these get reorganized, reshaped, many things get abolished, no more acceptable. This particular custom is not acceptable anymore. We have more advanced, more egalitarian, more equal, or a system or an ideal that provides some better condition for the larger good. So that way society progresses from the old to the new. There is a discarding of old and the emergence of the new. In that process, thinker plays a role in calling out from the subconscious and giving it form so that it begins to get established as an idea in the society and slowly begin to transform the society. It absorbs the ideative influence and tries, not with any striking success, to mold its institutions into new forms, touched by these higher ideals. But always its instinct is to translate them into binding law, into pattern forms, into mechanic customs, into an external social compulsion upon its living units. So the moment society takes it up from the individual, society will convert that into a binding law, a pattern, a mechanic custom, an external social compulsion upon its living units. Living units are the individual. Collectivity is the semi-conscious mechanical entity. While this entity absorbs from the individual who brings in new idea, but it converts these ideas into new customs, new forms, new binding laws. So, but always its instinct is to translate them into binding law. It is here the society, the mass consciousness, is to translate them into binding law, into pattern forms, into mechanic custom, into an external social compulsion upon its living units. Because this collectivity has its native instinct to compel the living units of its constituent elements to conform to whatever be the social idea it is holding in itself. It will tend to impose this, even when this transition it received from the individual. Few individuals starts and it spreads, and then social institutions undergo transformation, and then institutions will impose upon the larger collectivity. That's how that transformation happens. For long after the individual has become partially free, a moral organism capable of conscious growth, aware of an inward life, eager for spiritual progress, society continues to be external in its methods, a material and economic organism, mechanical, more intent upon status and self-preservation than on growth and self-perfection. Within the individual, as the individual awakens, as one reaches the mental stage of evolution, mind brings this constant search for growth and self-perfection. It is native to the mind to search for greater truth, greater knowledge, and perfect things. This is fundamental to the mind. In a society, even when the individuals have grown and reached a space of a moral organism capable of conscious growth, a moral organism, aware of an inward life. So individuals can become more and more conscious of their impulses, drives, and begin to regulate based on principles, morality. And even when the individuals are ready for spiritual progress, even then, the society continues to be external in its methods. Society would establish rules, regulations, and impose it upon the individuals. Its approach is external. It creates an externalized institutions of laws and institutions of imposing laws. A material and economic organism. This society is also materialistic and economic organism. Mechanical, more intent on status and self-preservation. This vital physical organism of the collective being is more concerned about self-preservation and status of what it is, and what it has established, and what its current social idea is. It wants to preserve and conserve all the time. Then on growth and self-perfection. This collective being really doesn't have the instinct for continuous growth and self-perfection. That's its tendency. The greatest present triumph of the thinking and progressive individual over the instinctive and static society has been the power he has acquired by his thought will to compel it to think also, to open itself to the idea of social justice and righteousness, communal sympathy and mutual compassion, to feel after the rule of reason rather than blind custom as the test of its institutions, and to look on the mental and moral ascent of its individuals as at least one essential element in the validity of its laws. So this is what has emerged in this last century, the triumph of the thinker in compelling the society to review its policies, laws, and continuously upgrade them. and consult the light of reason and not live entirely by impulse, habits, custom. Bring in light of reason, constantly review and change the policies, processes, social laws. So that has been one of the triumphs of the last century, we can see. It has been now very well established in the collectivity that reason has to be brought in. One cannot go on saying that it is the custom. It is the habit. So every organization, every society is forced to relook at all that they do from the growing light of reason. So greatest present triumph of the thinking and progressive individual over the instinctive and static society. So there is a progressive individual who is imposing himself upon the instinctive and static society. Society tends to be static. It doesn't want to move forward. It wants to conserve. It wants to preserve. It wants to reject progress because it is mechanical, habitual, and tendency is to be very, very conservative. Therefore, it remains static. Whereas the individual is progressive. The moment you open to the mind, rational intelligence, the progressive individual is born. And such a thinking and progressive individual imposes over the instinctive and static society that new light. This has been the power he has acquired by his thought will to compel it to think also. That is, it is the progressive individual compels the society to think also, to open itself to the idea of social justice and righteousness, to relook at the notions of justice, what is right, communal sympathy and mutual compassion. Bring all this into the collectivity, to feel after the rule of reason rather than blind custom as the test of institutions. So here we have every institution get tested with this light of reason. Are you progressive institution or a conservative institution? Can you change your old archaic customs and open to progress? And to look on the mental and moral ascent of its individuals as at least one essential element in the validity of its laws. Is the law passed by the parliament, does it ring with people? At least the leading thinkers of the society, do they approve the law? This has been very well established now. The thinkers are playing their important role in bringing out from the unconscious that needs to be changed. And they give form to thought and plant new ideas, and that eventually change the laws. And that law has to be in alignment with what thinkers of the society has brought forth. So this is one of the greatest triumphs of the last century that we have seen. Ideally, at least, to consider light rather than force as its sanction. Moral development and not vengeance or restraint as the object even of its penal action is becoming just possible to the communal mind. So ideal is establishing itself as, instead of force, bring light. That means knowledge is a better arbiter than force. It is not might is right. What is the right knowledge? What is the right understanding? What is the light of reason? And it is the moral development that is to be focused upon, not vengeance or restraint as the object even of its penal action. If we are to provide punishment to people, what is the nature of that penal action, penalty for any wrongdoing? It is moral development. We have to educate people instead of doing vengeance and restraint. Putting people in jail fundamentally doesn't transform them. It restrains them. It punishes them, but fundamentally they have not changed. Can the approach be different? can education be brought in? Now, any progressive society would consider this as more and more important. Any society is doing that will be considered as a more progressive society, where you are not looking at your criminals as people to be taken vengeance and restrained, but people need to be educated. Moral development has to be brought in. So ideally, at least, to consider light rather than force as its sanction. Moral development and not vengeance or restraint as the object even of its penal action is becoming just possible to the communal mind. So these are all the great progress humanity has made in terms of its inner development with mental development that was unfolding. The greatest future triumph of the thinker will come when he can persuade the individual integer and the collective whole to rest their life relation and its union and stability upon a free and harmonious consent and self-adaptation, and shape and govern the external by the internal truth, rather than to constrain the inner spirit by the tyranny of the external form and structure. The greatest future triumph of the thinker will come when he can persuade. Sri Aurobindo is referring to this as the future triumph. These are not things yet accomplished in the collective life of humanity. It is a future triumph of the thinker when he can persuade the individual integer, a whole person, individual integer, and the collective whole, collectivity is another whole, between the two, to rest their life relation and its union and stability. So on one hand, they have a dynamic life relationship, a union, and it has to have a certain stability. This has to be based upon a free and harmonious consent and self-adoption. An individual becoming part of the collectivity by consent and self-adoption. Similarly, a group accepting an individual into the group, mutual consent-based self-adoption and coming together, and shape and govern the external by the internal truth. So the external life has to be governed by the internal truth, the age of reason giving birth to subjective age. How the individuals are feeling, what their internal reference system is, what are the values upheld by the individuals of the society. That will govern, not external forces and external systems. Shape and govern the external by the internal truth, rather than to constrain the inner spirit by the tyranny of the external form and structure. So giving more and more space for the inner spirit to emerge, instead of letting it suffocate under the external form and structure. That will be the triumph of the thinker in a society, where inner law begins to govern the outer, not other way around. And the inner spirit finds its greater expression in the society. Individuals become the means for the collectivity itself to progress. So that will be the triumph of the thinker in a society. But even this success that he has gained is rather a thing in potentiality than in actual accomplishment. So while we see that will be a wonderful ideal to live from within and shape the outer by the inner governance, the journey of the external form and structure is removed. While all that are wonderful ideals, it is only a potentiality. It is not yet an actually accomplished fact of our social life. A consent-based grouping where individual and collective forms a stable relationship, this is something yet to manifest on earth. That is something of future development of humanity. Sri Aurobindo has covered this topic extensively in The Ideal of Human Unity. This issue of individual and collective mutually coming to a harmonious relationship, that's the evolutionary step. So even this success that he has gained is rather a thing in potentiality than in actual accomplishment. There is always a disharmony and a discord between the moral law in the individual and the law of his needs and desires, between the moral law proposed to society and the physical and vital needs, desires, customs, prejudices, interests, and passions of the caste, the clan, the religious community, the society, the nation. So while on one side we are able to conceive intellectually a beautiful ideal, conceptually we can understand. We say, wow, such a society will be wonderful when there is no external compulsion. Individual and the group are in mutual consent and harmonious relationship, and the collectivity serves the individual's fulfillment. Individual serves the collectivity. All this we can conceive by the mind as an intellectual ideal, mental ideal. But there is a gap between what mind can conceive and what we are as a vital physical creature. There, all our lower nature is there waiting to be transformed. Between the moral law proposed to the society and the physical and vital needs. So on one side, what is proposed to the society. On the other side, we have physical and vital needs, desires, customs, prejudices, interests, and passions. All these are there. We are passionate creatures. We have self-interest. We have prejudices. We have our customs that we are used to. We have desires. We have needs. All that are there. And not only that, this exists at an individual level, it exists of the caste, the clan, the religious community, the society, the nation. Even a nation has these formations. Passions, interests, prejudices, customs, desires, needs. At every scale this exists. So there is a gap between what the human mind can conceive as an ideal, as a potential future, and yet it has to deal with this aspect of human nature individually and collectively. There is always a disharmony and a discord. Disharmony and a discord between the moral law in the individual. Moral law in the individual and the law of his needs and desires, between the moral law proposed to society and the physical and vital needs, desires, customs, prejudices, interests, and passions of the caste, the clan, the religious community, the society, the nation. Within an individual, we often find that which one is aspiring for and that which one is bound by habits, impulses, cravings. So you find yourself to be a bundle of habits in spite of having a beautiful mental ideal. Yes, I am interested in yoga. I want to progress this way. I want to do this thing. That would be wonderful. But you see yourself to be individually bound by old habits, customs, and within that routine trapped. Similarly, it's not just individual. You may propose a law to the society. If you are a leader, you try to change the social organization. You introduce new rules, new regulations, but the collectivity doesn't adopt. Changing a collective form, organizational culture is extremely difficult because we have physical, vital needs, desires, customs, prejudices, interests, and passions of the caste, the clan, the religious community, the society, the nation. We are bound by these things. Therefore, it becomes nearly impossible to change the system, even when you have a mental conception of what is the right ideal to bring in. There is a gap between thought and action, conception and realization. There is generally a big gap and a conflict. The moralist erects in vain his absolute ethical standard and calls upon all to be faithful to it without regard to consequences. That is what a moralist would do. Erects in vain because it won't be successful. His absolute ethical standard. So a moralist would erect an absolute ethical standard and calls upon all to be faithful to it without regard to consequences. So all religions does that, all philosophers does that, all organizational leaders does that. Like creating absolute ethical standard and calls upon all to be faithful to it without regard to consequences. To him, the need and desire of the individual are invalid if they are in conflict with the moral law, and the social law has no claim upon him if it is opposed to his sense of right and denied by his conscience. So this conflict come into picture. To him, the needs, the one who is trying to establish the moral, ethical law, to him, the needs and desires of the individual are invalid if they are in conflict with the moral law that he is proposing. So individual needs, these are to be overwritten by the collective. The social law has no claim upon him if it is opposed to his sense of right and denied by his conscience. So on one hand, the ethical moralists want everyone to conform to the rules and regulations that he wants to bring in. On the other hand, all the social laws and regulations, if it denies his conscience and it is not his own sense of right, then he would not accept it. So to him, the needs and desires of the individual are invalid if they are in conflict with the moral law. And the social law has no claim upon him if it is opposed to his sense of right and denied by his conscience. This is his absolute solution, or the individual, that he shall cherish no desires and claims that are not consistent with love, truth, and justice. So that's how the idealist cast his solution. This is his absolute solution. Or the individual, that he shall cherish no desires and claims that not consistent with love, truth, and justice. When love, truth, and justice become your absolute reference, then all your personal desires and claims are to be discarded. He shall cherish no desires and claims that are not consistent with love, truth, and justice. So these are the idealist absolute standards erected in a society. He demands from the community or nation that it shall hold all things cheap, even its safety and its most pressing interest, in comparison with truth, justice, and humanity, and the highest good of its people. So the thinker would demand from the community or even from the nation that it should hold all things cheap, even its safety and its most pressing interest, in comparison with truth, justice, and humanity, and the highest good of all people. So there are always dreamers of the society, idealists of the society, who will hold the community or the nation accountable for truth, justice, and humanity, and highest good of all, no matter what happens. This has to be upheld as the absolute non-compromising values. But in practice, we see it doesn't work, where individuals are bound by their vital instinctive nature. There is an animal creature within the individual. So there is again a conflict. On one hand, there is an absolute moralist ethical principle brought in by the thinker into the society, and yet in practice it remains only as a potentiality, as a possibility, not a realized fact, because we are bound by our animal instincts, vital instincts, and These things drive and bind a society. Yet, that's a space where the revolutionary thinker exposes its hypocrisy, demand the nation, the society, to correct its errors and demand the highest good of all. That's the role of the thinker. Even if it is a potentiality, if it is not yet realized, yet that is the role of the thinker who is driven from within to shed that light of reason to otherwise mechanical, habitual, half-conscious, mass consciousness. So with that, we come to the end of this episode. Thank you for being with me in this journey. Please do share your perceptions, your own understanding, the challenges that you have faced in your own growth from the habit-driven person to more conscious individual living by principles, values, and trying to spread that into the society. How was it for you? Dwell on it, think about it, so that this knowledge become very practical, lived experience of your own life. And please do share if you would like to, or I would love to see you sharing so that it helps everyone. Thank you. See you next week.